We're very fortunate in Interpol World Television to have Dr John Coyne, who's from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. John, welcome to Interpol World Television.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
Right, Australian Strategic Policy Institute. What is it? What do you do?
Okay. This is a good history lesson on this one, which is about 18 years ago. The Australian government was going through a series of rather large defence purchases. And what it found, and unlike, say, the US or the UK, we don't have a really strong community of think tanks. So, we don't have a RUSI and we don't have a CSIS. So, at the time, our Prime Minister, in a very strange show of bipartisanship, met with the Leader of the Opposition, so John Howard, Kim Bees, and they said, there's not enough contested policy in this national security space. We need a different voice, and we also need to have an improved public policy dialogue. So out of that, they created ASPI. Now, ASPI is it's a national security think tank, and it's growing. So we cover off on a range of issues. So everything from cyber all the way through to law enforcement, national security. Buying $52 billion worth of submarines, and the idea really is this. Improve public policy dialogue on national security in our region and in our country. And secondly, and that's the public side of it, is give contested policy advice to government.
And what are the security priorities that the Institute's seeing and you're seeing, and what are your responsibilities within it?
Look, I think that if we were to look globally, and I think this is probably one of those great challenges, which is reflecting back 1980s, and you and I are sort of old enough to remember that. I think it's important to say that 1980s we had the world was it was bipolar, for want of a better term. We had two great powers competing, one on the side of the world, Russia, on the other side of the world, the US, and with that we had the fear of an existential threat, so the end of mankind, thermonuclear war. In contrast now, 3 decades later, we have a far more complex world. And not just because it's multipolar, so all of a sudden, we have a return of a very assertive Russia, returning back into some of its old territories and asserting power and influence, both soft and hard, in the Middle East. We also have an assertive Chinese government that's doing exactly the same in Southeast Asia. So all of a sudden, we've got a very different world. Not an existential threat, but there's a lot of unpredictables. And I think if we were to look at now the big challenges of our time, there can be no doubt that strategic miscalculation and operational misadventure is key to that. And that is because, unlike the 80s, this new multipolar world, we don't have that same level of guarantee. We don't have a rich matrix to understand how people make decisions, and we don't have a mutually assured destruction to keep people from doing...
And we are seeing a growth in power projection capabilities from a military perspective across the region.
Across the region, and it's extending. So what we've seen over the last sort of 2 decades, certainly by the Chinese government, is massive investments in the ability to project power across the region. We've seen them not only building the size of their armed forces, but the capability, and going through massive modernisation processes, and that's repeated across the region. The other big issue we're seeing is this sort of economic and integration. So globalisation hasn't failed. Like, a lot of people think that globalisation failed, but it hasn't. What we're seeing is a real thickening of the connections for global supply chains. We're seeing the beginnings of Industry 4.0. And we're seeing massive investments by the Chinese with their Belt and Road Initiative. So in this region of ASEAN, of 10 countries, they've never been so connected as they are today. You can move faster. The velocity of things coming across borders and the volume are both increasing, which are all good economic things. But with that comes a whole heap of new challenges and new vulnerabilities, and trying to understand those is the big challenge. Now, in terms of my research, I think, it's those things that are really quite exciting and where analysis needs to be done, because quite often what's required is big paradigm shifts in the way we think about the problems.
You didn't mention the terrorist threat. Now, we've had Christchurch, we've had a number of incidents through Australia. How big is the terrorist threat in the region? And does it reflect the level it's at across the globe anyway?
Well, look, I think And we're talking about, and in terms of the question was about, what's emerging. I think the terrorism threat is rather consistent at the moment. The unknowns of that, or the wild cards, of course, are the fall of the caliphate, and also, the big question mark over what next for AQ. We learnt in this region, certainly with groups like Jamaat Islamiyah and the Abu Sayyaf group, so we learnt from the first Afghani war, that when those foreign fighters returned back into the Philippines, back into Indonesia, they became key members in terms of capability and leadership in what would become Jamaat Islamiyah and the Abu Sayyaf group. So there is a wildcard element in that. In terms of right-wing extremism and white supremacy and the Christchurch attack, I think it's an unfortunate situation where globally what we're seeing is, for a variety of reasons, I guess more acceptance of hate speech than we've seen for a very long time, and mainstreaming of those sorts of discussions. But on top of that is that there's a small percentage in terms of right-wing extremists globally. There's a very small percentage who are the types of people who are going to do harm, the most extreme of the extreme. And in the past, they tended to be very isolated. What we see now is through platforms like 8chan online, we get a whole range of the worst who are able to create a global echo chamber, and all of a sudden they can feed off each other. And I think Tarrant in Christchurch was an example of that. I mean, he chose his target quite carefully in terms of the country he was doing it in, where he could access the type of weapons which he needed to be able to undertake such a dramatic attack.
Now, you're always a great advocate of intelligence-led decision-making and operations. Is that still your feeling?
Look, absolutely. I guess the only thing is, and this is a thing for, for people of our age group, which is, we started our career in times of looking where qualitative analysis, and all the things that went across that were so important, and it's still important, I'm not saying it's not, but increasingly the big challenge in intelligence is, how do we bring the quantitative people into our field? How do we get them to operate and work with the qualitative intelligence people? And how do we use both to create good quality products that guide clients and stakeholders and will help them in their decision making? Now, whether you're in law enforcement or whether you're in defence or geopolitics, I think it's really true. We're seeing this sort of real change in it. And it's very easy to sort of try to keep the two separate, but I think that the fields have to be joined in. And just recently I was talking about it, and it's like, I was asked a question by a young student about how to build an intelligence team, and I said, it's different now. And my intelligence team would have far more data scientists and data analysts than they would have people like me. So it is changing. So I'm still a big advocate for intelligence, and I always will be. But I'm also an advocate that the way we do intelligence has to change, and we have to become better quant guys in the process.
Now, you've been part of the keynote team that there is at Interpol World this year. What are the messages that you were giving out? A lot of the people that will be watching this didn't manage to make it this year. So, what are the key things that you want to leave with them?
Look, in my case, I was very fortunate. We did a big panel discussion around financial intelligence or financial crime. And the big thing that in that space was this, is that we have to start working more with the private sector. And there's got to be a lot more private-public partnerships. Secondly is that 2 decades ago, government's ownership of technological edges ended. Policymakers and people like myself, and I take responsibility for it, we just didn't accept that for a long time. So now, in terms of even the technology we need, separate from just financial issues and financial crime, the technology we need is developed in the private sector, and we need to get much more comfortable at engaging with that. And that's going to change some real fundamentals around the sort of people we hire. The old hierarchical structures of how people get promoted. And there's a whole heap of really invigorating changes that need to come along. The final piece is this, which is, and there's been a lot of talk here about it, which is about paradigm shifts. Okay, so law enforcement in most countries, it's very clear, their performance is measured by arrests, seizures of drugs, seizures of money, successful prosecutions. That may no longer be the case in the new world. So there's a lot of things that we need to concentrate on now going, is the approach to money laundering or anti-money laundering, should we have such a focus on prosecution, or should we, like cybercrime, have a much more of a focus on cyber hygiene and crime prevention and financial crime prevention? So they're big challenges, and they require us all to sit there and question our work. And ultimately, it's really summed up quite well, which is, we're at a crossroads where we have to reconsider whether we're doing things right or we're doing the right things. And we want to do a little bit of both, but we need to constantly check the assumptions that go behind that.
So as someone who's sitting there advising what might be going on in the future and looking into it, what keeps you awake at night?
What keeps me awake at night? For me, it's a complexity of it all. I think that increasingly is that because the world is changing so quickly in terms of technology, and what we're seeing is you have super specialist fields, and at the same time you have to be able to take a helicopter or a satellite view of it. So the two combined mean that, and I'll give you an example in this region. Globally, we're seeing increasingly a food protein shortage. As a result of that, many countries are operating global fishing fleets. Global fishing fleets in this region have also been used in terms of assertive naval activities, pushing up on borders, etc. So you have this confluence of issues, and where there's because of its complexity, a real chance of, as I said right at the start, strategic miscalculation, operational misadventure. And I always say, two 25-year-old fighter pilots flying past each other at an amazing speed who make a bad decision. And I think that's what keeps me, that complexity and uncertainty keeps me awake at night and trying to understand it.
John, absolutely fascinating. I could talk to you all day quite easily, but thank you very much indeed for giving up your valuable time to talk to us on Interpol World Television. A real pleasure. Cheers.